This is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another Tabletops and Taverns. In the vein of the last episode, where I gave a quick rundown on elements that I personally believed made for a good game master, this time I'm going to take a look at some of the elements that I personally enjoy seeing in the player at my table. Now, before I get into this, I should note that what defines a good player is going to vary from DM to DM and game to game, and may refer to several aspects of playing the game, from preparation to characterization to merely being a pleasant individual. Further, just how good a player is in any one of those categories is kind of a matter of scale. 3 or 4 people can exhibit various qualities that make for good players to different degrees, and all would be a joy to play with. I'm not going to be one of those joy and sunshine types that tells you that all players are good players. If you've been DMing for any length of time, you know that's just not true. There are some players who are disruptive, either intentionally or not. There are players who are just toxic to a particular group, etc., etc. So that kind of puts a lie to the idea that all players are good players. But without the bad, the good ones wouldn't stand out, and it's worth mentioning those that stand out. So what sorts of player qualities are good at your table are largely going to define how well your group clicks together, and most likely will have to do with how well the players themselves complement your particular strengths and weaknesses as a DM. Still, I believe that some of the aspects that I appreciate in a player are likely to be useful and recognizable across a variety of different types of groups. I'll try to note where possible when a particular quality may be more relevant to my particular strengths and weaknesses as a DM, but for the most part I'm going to try and focus on things that we'll cover across the board. So, in the foreword to the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook, Mike Carr listed 5 guidelines players could follow to make for a more enjoyable game. To paraphrase roughly, they were 1. Be an organized player. 2. Cooperate with the DM and respect their decisions. 3. Cooperate with other players and respect their right to participate. 4. If you're unable to participate in an adventure, give other players and the DM guidelines on what your character would do. And 5. Get into the spirit of the game. Now, granted, there were a number of caveats for all of these. For instance, cooperating with the DM didn't mean just rolling over. It meant that if there were disagreements, mention them. Present the concerns and your viewpoint to the DM with a respectful tone, and then respect the DM's final arbitration. Now, these guidelines were laid out almost 40 years ago. In fact, if you're viewing this video in just a year or two from now, it will have been the full 40 years. But you know what? Fundamentally speaking, these guidelines form a kernel of what being a good player in most games is even to this day. Now, if we boil these 5 guidelines down to their base component parts, well, we get a few extraneous pieces here and there. For the most part, they can basically be described by just a few principles. First among them is that role-playing is a cooperative game, and thus all of the players, including the DM, deserve respect. This includes respect of their right to participate in their various roles, respect for the time they take out of their schedules to engage in this pastime with one another, and respect for their contributions to the game as a whole. Even the secondary mentions, like being organized, making sure that others have enough information about your character, etc., etc., all kind of stem from either respect or one of the principles I will mention later. Since basically you're doing what you can on your end to respect the time others have invested in making sure that the game flows smoothly. But I'm going to be perfectly honest here. Providing a basic level of respect for the time and existence of other human beings you interact with isn't just a good step in gaming, it's a good idea in general. If you can't get that part right, then I honestly probably can't help you much. So we're going to presume for the moment, now that attention has been called to it, that this idea of respecting other players and the effort and time that they put into the game can be extrapolated to all the things that derive from basic respect. So instead, we're going to focus on the other aspects now in terms of what I believe makes a player pleasant to have at the table. And for that, I have 4 other principles from which you can derive a number of qualities that can be helpful to playing any sort of game, but especially role-playing games. We'll start with enthusiasm for the game, and then move on to dependability, adaptability, and creativity. Many of these are very obvious, but it's the specific applications thereof that matter. You can be really enthusiastic to play, but how you channel that into your actions determines how useful that quality ends up being. Same with any of the other three. So starting with enthusiasm, just because it's largely the easiest. As I pointed out in my GMing philosophy video, wanting to be a GM is critical. For nothing can really be built up if the GM just doesn't want to be the GM. And the same is true as a player, although in their case it's usually easier to gin up enthusiasm. After all, the player has a relatively limited amount of work to do to participate, compared at least to the GM. It's still critical that the player actually wants to play, however. If you have at least them wanting to play, then the rest can be worked on later. So what sort of player doesn't have enthusiasm for the game? I mean, surely if somebody's lined up to play a role-playing game, they want to, right? Not necessarily. Some people may be roped into a game just to fill out seats, which means that they're not going to be very interested or very invested in it. Also, significant others or family members, friends who have very little interest in the game in general, may attend just out of a sense of obligation to their friend or loved one. Sometimes these reluctant players do have at least some enthusiasm. Perhaps they genuinely want to see what their friend or loved one does during their hobby, and so there's that kernel of wanting to play, if only for that part alone. But other times, they may only be there to humor someone, or lack any general enthusiasm or desire to actually participate. And that's going to affect not only their enjoyment and what they see in the game, but also it'll affect how they interact with the other players. So long as there's some kernel of actual desire to play the game, then everything else can be worked out. But if someone is only there to fill a spot, doesn't really want to be there, sometimes it's better to just proceed with an empty seat than to try to involve somebody who clearly is not interested. So how does enthusiasm translate into being a good player? Well, someone with enthusiasm for the game is liable to spend a little bit more time and effort on it. If they don't know a system but genuinely want to learn, they're probably going to actually take the time to do so. If the player is enthusiastic about their character, they're more likely to go that extra mile to develop the little details and quirks that, while optional, really help to pin that character and the storyline involving them together. Backgrounds, quirks, mannerisms, those sorts of things take effort to both come up with and apply consistently, and enthusiasm really helps with that. So presuming that we have a group of players that are to varying degrees enthusiastic over the game, the next thing I look for is dependability. And I want to specifically focus on dependability of schedule, although other things like dependability of being able to keep track of their character sheets and things like that are also very useful. But we'll focus on schedule. This is not to say that somebody who can't commit to a particular schedule is somehow a bad person. Life happens. Some people have difficult work lives. Some people have difficult home lives. But if I'm going to gather a group of disparate people together to play a game on a regular schedule, I need to know that when the time comes, those people will actually be able to show up. At least most of the time. Missing a game from time to time happens. I've had to cancel things in the past when things came up suddenly. But I've also had issues with people whose schedules changed, but the player didn't really want to face that fact. They'd overcommit. They'd be unable to make it to more than half of the games. I've had other instances where people just didn't care. They'd show up whenever they felt like it, with no real concern for how they inconvenienced others whom they made to wait or just blew off entirely. Both of them were kind of irritating, both types of people were kind of irritating, but at least the first type was more understandable. Their heart was in the right place even if their mind was not. Whether somebody has extreme difficulty in making a game due to scheduling or just because they don't care, it really ends up, though, with the DM having the same problem. The DM is still left with an empty seat a lot of times either way. I'd personally rather know beforehand for the simple fact that I could then get a new player to fill that spot out. So far we've got dependability and enthusiasm and dependability, and those both have direct impact on actual assembly of the game group and the energy that goes with it. The next quality that I really enjoy seeing in my players is adaptability. And that's one that generally has more impact both on playing the game and the actions taken in the game. People who are adaptable will show a flexibility either in their own preferences, allowing you to run different genres or systems as necessary, or within the game itself. An adaptable player may be able to play different classes or roles based on the needs of the group as a whole, rather than their own preferences, and this will allow the others that have a strong preference for a particular character type to go with their first choice, and then fill in the rest with a player who's willing to be adaptable about it. Adaptability may manifest itself within the game as well. The player may be able to adapt to different combat tactics, work out when to approach different encounters in different ways, deal with sudden changes to the adventures or the campaign itself that may or may not be the result of their fellow players. But once you start covering this sort of in-game effect, it really begins to verge towards my final quality here that really stands out, and that's creativity. Now, I've mentioned before that creativity isn't that important when it comes to running the game. Not saying it isn't important, just saying it's not usually in my top list of importance. As long as you come up with something that people have fun with, it really doesn't matter if some of it feels somewhat derivative. In fact, it can help you paint a picture of an NPC or a situation in your players' minds quickly if they can draw parallels with things that they know about already. For a player, however, creativity is a little bit more important. Partly because instead of playing a large number of roles that have to be readily grasped in a relatively brief time, a player plays a single character over a longer period that really ends up needing to be in more depth than most NPCs. Partly, however, because as I mentioned under adaptability, a player may encounter a number of situations which may require creative solutions, and creativity in that will help them in the long run. Now, creativity is more than simply being original for originality's sake. It's more than just picking weird things and saying, oh, look how creative I am. No. A creative character may very well use common tropes and archetypes, but a decently creative player will be able to flesh those out and make the character feel whole and feel like their own. A particular situation that arises in play may certainly invite creative solutions, but a truly creative player will be able to determine alternate solutions that the DM may not necessarily have thought about that may save the party resources and time, which are the primary two things that will limit an adventuring group's ability to adventure long term. It can be a challenge for some DMs to have a really creative player, but I personally enjoy players that take that time to create original and well thought out solutions to unexpected situations. It keeps me on my toes. And honestly, I can worry less about throwing really challenging situations at them because I can be confident in their ability to deal with whatever I dish out, or at least have some plan in place, or be able to come up with a plan on the fly to handle them. As an added bonus is that if you have a couple really creative players in your group, you can take hints from their interactions and approaches and let them help write the campaign's details, either explicitly, such as in a game like Dungeon World, or simply by incorporating things that they come up with on their own based on things that they think might be clues, and then you as the DM can make those things canon. So if you're approaching this from the player's point of view, don't worry about coming up with things off the fly. Sometimes, as long as your DM's allowing that sort of thing, don't worry about seeing connections that aren't there, because sometimes that's actually helpful for the DM to go ahead and work off of. Now, there's a number of other things that help make a player a joy to play with, but they're usually relatively minor, and a lot of times they can be derived from one of the principles that I listed above, just a more focused version of it. You may note that I didn't list familiarity with a system as a quality which I really look for. Now, it can be helpful in that you'll have less work to do teaching that particular person a system and bringing them up to speed. But familiarity with a system in and of itself is sometimes a trade-off for the DM, and that the player who is very familiar with a system may get into rules lawyer territory if they're not careful, or at the very least may be difficult to surprise. So honestly, I could take it or leave it. If somebody's not familiar with a system but is genuinely enthusiastic and adaptable, they'll learn in short order. So if you're a player and you're worried that your lack of knowledge of a system may hold you back, if it's a new game, a lot of people will cut you some slack a lot of times, and if they don't, that's probably not the kind of group that you're looking for. As long as you make an effort to learn, as long as you make that effort to at least read the rules and get familiar with them over time, then even if you don't know them right off the bat, there's that core to work with. Enthusiasm, as I said above. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Remember, every GM is going to have a different personality and a different skill set. So being a good player at a particular table is going to require not only a mix of the principles above, but may also include different things. However, if you're worried about whether or not you're a good player, just ask yourself this. Do you respect the group that you're joining? Do you respect that they have a different number of people there that are looking to have fun just like you? Are you enthusiastic for the game? Do you want to play? And can you make time for it? Adaptability and creativity are talents that can honestly be learned a little bit, but as long as you've got those first three down, respect, enthusiasm, and dependability to get there on time and on schedule, then the last two can be developed, and those three will go a long way towards making you a decent player in the eyes of most DMs, at least in my experience. The rest can be worked out over time. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and leave it at that. I hope that this has been helpful to you as a player if you've been wondering what kinds of things may make you a good player, and I hope this is helpful for other people who have watched my DM style and wonder where I'm coming from on that. Anyway, this has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to leave a like, comment if you've got feedback, and subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer. If you're feeling particularly generous and would like to help support this channel, please consider checking out my Patreon at patreon.com/rpgcrawler or through the links in the description below. Until next time, take care and goodbye.